Hi there, and today on Under the Big Tree, we're going to be looking at the Girl Synth CG31 digital noise source. Now, I have this module within my Swamp panel from Elby Designs, but you can also get it separately and be able to have it work within a Serge system, a Eurorack system, whatever you might want. So before we look at the specifics of this module, let's talk about what noise is for a minute. So what is noise? Well, I like to think of a noise module as the opposite of an oscillator. So if we have an oscillator, we have this thing that's going consistently over and over and over again at a particular frequency, and the wave shape of that oscillation creates the timbre of the sound. So a sawtooth or a sine wave or a square wave all has a different wave shape. But how frequently it repeats that cycle is what gives us the frequency of that sound. Noise, on the other hand, is complete randomness. So rather than having something that is well formed and that goes along a track, we have something that is continuously varying from amplitude to amplitude to amplitude. And it happens so quickly that you don't hear it as individual frequencies. Instead, it just becomes a cloud or a wash. Now, noise can be generated either via analog means or digital means. So let's start by listening to analog noise, just to hear what that sounds like. So this isn't a noise generator, it is simply a Telefunken V72 microphone preamp cranked all the way up with nothing into it and then plugged into the mixer. So let's hear what that sounds like. There's no frequency there, of course. It just sounds like that sound that we're so familiar with. That's the basis of wind sounds and rain sounds and water sounds and so many different synthesizer type sounds. In addition, we can equalize this noise sound to be able to bring out different frequency ranges. So we can get a lot of different timbres out of that one sound, and of course this is why we find noise generators in virtually every synthesizer. Okay, so now that we've had a listen to what analog noise sounds like, let's take a look at this CGS31 digital noise generator. Now the way that this system works is that there is a clock, and that clock is running typically at a very high rate of speed, and every time there is another tick or another pulse to the clock, it generates a pseudo-random number. Now, in this case, because it's a digital number, it's not 100% actually random. However, pseudo-random is more than good enough for our purposes. We have a sequence of amplitudes that give us the sound of a white noise or a pink noise, and eventually, if you were looking at it on an oscilloscope and you wanted to spend the time to map it out, you could probably see how that pattern repeats over and over again. But to the human ear, it's more than good enough when we don't hear it. So what does that sound like? Well, let's start by listening to the white noise output. To me, it sounds similar to the analog noise that we just heard, but it's a little bit grittier. Now let's hear the pink noise. Much less high frequency content, as you would expect for a pink noise sound versus a white noise sound. And then let's hear this random gate sound. So now we have something that's even brighter and harsher than the white noise output. So what does this all mean? Well, the way that the CGS31 works is that we have these noise outputs here that are driven by this clock system that's down here. So when this switch is set to internal mode, then the clock itself is a VCO that is built into this circuit that is running. And every time we get to a new tick of the VCO, then it generates a new random sound up here. So if we have this switch set to internal, we look down here, we can see that here is this knob called clock rate. So why don't we listen to what happens when we listen to the white noise and we start turning that clock rate down. What we will hear is more and more and more graininess to the noise as it is generating new pulses more and more and more slowly. So we can hear it going from a fairly smooth white noise. As we move it down, it gets grittier and grittier. And you can hear the individual ticks at this point. Now, for those of you who grew up in the 80s like I did, that sound is very similar to a sound from the video game Defender when the ship would get blown up. Now let's hear what the pink noise sounds like when we slow the clock down. We get that same grittiness towards the end. And then finally the random gates. Now, because this is a digital noise source, with a clock that drives it, we can do a lot of stuff to change the timbre of the noise by manipulating the speed of the clock. So we are still working with this internal VCO, and as we saw before, moving the clock rate changes the character of the noise quite a bit by speeding it up and slowing it down. But this blue input here allows us to do control voltage modulation of that clock rate. So let's start by putting a pulse LFO into there and see what it sounds like. So the pulse is changing the speed of the digital noise, and the result of that is that we're getting something that sounds sort of filtery. Let's see what that sounds like if we put it into a triangle LFO instead. Very cool. Now, when we have a CV coming in, this clock rate actually serves as an attenuator for the CV that's coming in. So that shows how strongly the signal that's coming in is attenuating the clock itself. Now let's slowly modulate that from a triangle-shaped LFO to a sawtooth and see what happens. Slow it down. Or speed up the LFO. Very cool. All right, now that we've experimented with an LFO, now let's plug an oscillator in, something that's going to get up into the audio range, and see how that changes the sound. So right now, we're listening to a sine wave coming out of an oscillator as slow as possible. Let's raise the frequency of the oscillator. And it really has some filtering characteristics on the sound of the noise. Let's try a different sound. Let's try a sawtooth. Also starting all the way down. So we're starting to get some side bands, some FM sounding sort of stuff. And let's try a pulse. Okay, so up to this point, we've been modulating the clock rate of the internal oscillator by modulating it using that blue input. But we also have the ability to plug our own clock, our own oscillator, into this system and then be able to use it directly. So let's see what that sounds like. I've plugged that same oscillator, a sawtooth in this case, into the clock input, and we're going to flip the switch from internal to external. And now it is so slow that you can just hear random clicks here and there. Let's slowly move it up and see what happens. And interestingly, when we get up past a certain frequency, it stops entirely. And my theory is because at that point the oscillator is moving faster than the analog chips inside of the noise system can handle. But as soon as we get back down again into that frequency, it works okay. Now let's hear what happens if instead of using a sawtooth, let's try a sine wave. Sounds about the same. And a pulse. Sounds about the same. Until we get down into the really slow frequencies. So now here's a slow frequency pulse. Saw, a little different. And a sine, a little different. Now, let's go back up with our saw, and just like we did already, modulating the voltage of the oscillator, we can do the same thing by modulating the voltage, the frequency of our new clock. So let's do the same thing. So I'm plugging a triangle in to the 1 volt per octave input of that oscillator. And we are getting a pretty cool sound. No filter needed at all. All we have is the white noise output of the digital noise source with the frequency of the oscillator that is generating the clock changing. Let's try speeding that LFO up. And this is why I love Serge modules so much, because they just have so many interesting nooks and crannies that you can explore. Now, let's talk for a minute about the outputs of the white, the pink, and the random gate. The output is going to the white noise through a low-pass filter. So let's have a quick listen to that, just to compare. So there is our white noise with the clock running at full bore. Now let's listen to the pink noise. The only difference between the white noise and the pink noise is different values of the resistors and capacitors that are in the circuit to create a different filter cutoff. Thus, the pink noise is a lot duller, and a lot of the higher frequencies that are present in the white noise are not present in the pink noise because of this fixed low-pass filter. Now let's listen to the gate. The gate is much brighter even than the white noise. And the reason is because it is just completely unvarnished. As near as I can tell from looking at the schematic, that is just the straight up random numbers coming out and hitting that gate. And we can see the LED on the random gate clicking along as it's triggering. Okay, let's wrap this up by listening to the random gate and playing with it a little bit. I have a dual universal slope generator that is continuously making a sound that's going into a VCA, and then the random gate itself is the voltage control input to the VCA. So let's hear what that sounds like. It sounds a little bit like a lawn sprinkler. Let's hear what it sounds like as we slow down the clock rate. All right, and now for fun, I'm going to take that same random gate and I am going to run it into a sequencer that is then generating a sequence that is changing the rise and fall time of the dual universal slope generator. So now we're getting a really interesting Morse code-y pitched type of sound. Let's hear what that sounds like. And just like with everything on the Serge, the smallest changes and the smallest tweaks and the smallest explorations will reward you with the most interesting sounds that are just hidden away there in the cracks and crevices. Well, that is it for this episode of Under the Big Tree. As always, if you like what we're doing, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. And for now, this is Nick, wishing you safe journeys and signing off.